One of the things I really love about Whitehead is this emphasis on aesthesis as the basis from which we do our philosophy and the thing that our philosophy is about. Our philosophy is not about final ultimate truths, right? It's about the evocation of intensities, I think Whitehead used somewhere, which I really love.
Welcome to Conversations in Process, a podcast from the Cobb Institute and Open Horizons. I'm Jared Morningstar, Operations Assistant at the Cobb Institute, co-hosting today along with Jay McDaniel, the chair of the board at the Cobb Institute. In this episode of the podcast, we talk with Kazi Adi Shakti about her interesting and provocative essay, Buddhism is Basically Useless. Kazi is an artist and theorist whose theoretical work primarily consists in the study and creative synthesis of process thought, Madhyamaka Buddhism, Western Marxism, and ecofeminist ethics. Kazi graduated with a BFA from the Maryland Institute College of Art, where she majored in interdisciplinary sculpture with a focus on computer modeling, 3D scanning, and digital fabrication. She currently works as a scanning specialist and digital artist in the 3D digitization industry. In this conversation, Kazi shares her intent behind writing this fascinating essay, Buddhism is Basically Useless. She talks about what it means for Buddhism to be useless from her perspective and why this is actually very Buddhist in a sense, and works to counteract some of the negative trends we see in modern religious affiliation. She also talks about 3 different ways of touching yourself that she explores in this essay, and how there's a continuity between the very physical understanding of this idea all the way up to self-reflexive gnosis. So very interesting ideas abound. And of course, Jay and Kazi especially talk about connections with process thought in the latter half of this conversation. All right, here's the discussion.
Would you just tell me a little bit about yourself and your background and how you learned so much about so many things?
Yeah, so I guess my background, I'm pretty much an artist predominantly, like first and foremost. I went to school for art. I studied a lot of different things, but I ended up finalizing in sculptural practice, particularly with digital fabrication, so using computers and 3D printers and stuff like that. But I've always had an interest in spirituality and philosophy and theory, particularly because theory has a lot of purchase in art school and a lot of currency. I use these economic terms consciously because it actually does leave a sour taste in my mouth in terms of the pretentiousness of the way people in art school might use theory. But all to say, there's a lot of theory going on in art school. So, and naturally, I did a lot of that too. And eventually, along with my art major, I also did a humanities minor, which is sort of this open-ended minor where based in the humanities department at school, sort of secondary to your art thesis, of course, because it's not a philosophy school. And I sort of did an unconventional kind of thesis for that, where I didn't really make a thesis at all. I just sort of had what I called an open-ended thesis that sort of more so lays out a foundation for sort of basically analyzing, why are we here in this ecological crisis, in this present global crisis, and what are all the different intersecting problems, and how do they all relate to each other on different levels of understanding, from personal to interpersonal to transpersonal, social, ecological, economic, and all the way to the cosmological. So this sort of big overview picture. And that's where a lot of my interest in Whitehead actually started, because I found his process relational view of things incredibly interesting, but also clarifying in how things actually seem to operate. And for a long time, I've always had this sort of interest in the relationship between contrasting oppositions and the places in which they disappear as oppositions and the places in which the tension is productive. And so I found Whitehead working exactly with that sentiment, particularly with, this sort of, I guess, if we can generally think about it in terms of sort of the mind-body split that we sort of see iterated over and over again through Western thinking and modes of practice. But I also didn't want to focus too much philosophically, but also, historically and concretely. So the Marxist tradition also informed a great deal of my thinking. And then Nagarjuna and Madhyamaka in particular are the kind of meta-conceptual framework of how to even understand the role of concepts. So I don't accidentally reify them in my project of analysis. So these three sort of major figures, as well as a fourth one, a kind of ecofeminist perspective. So ecofeminism, Whiteheadian process thought, Marxian political economy, and then Madhyamaka, all sort of a way for me to try to understand why we are where we are and where the direction is to go from here. And my artistic practice sort of worked on experimentally with a kind of relationship between digital fabrication and representation of like organic life. So a lot of my work consisted of 3D scanning and 3D modeling plants and 3D printing them and arranging them in installation as a way to think about this sort of relationship and tension between culture and nature, technical abstraction versus the concrete living thing, and in the relationship between two. Sorry, that was a lot, but that's sort of my sort of practical theoretical background.
I looked at, I've been studying your website a little bit and enjoying every bit of it. And
thank you.
Really, I really like Buddhism is basically useless, and we'll talk about that. But I really want to get into some of your other essays too. And I looked at the home page and the notion of, is it holopoiesis? Is that how you do this stuff? Mm-hmm. I love that. And I love the way you distinguish that from what is other poiesis, and then what's in self-poiesis? Is that right?
Yes. Autopoiesis and allopoiesis.
Autopoiesis and allopoiesis, yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
So very good. And I tell you, holopoiesis sure sounded a lot like Whitehead's idea of concrescence.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very influenced by Whitehead, definitely. I will say that I spent, I guess, 2 years in school sort of studying Whitehead along with the other stuff, and I wasn't able to go super deep into process and reality because it's a bit of a monster, but I extensively drew from Donald Sherburn's key to process and reality. It's very legible and very elucidating. But since then, ever since I've gotten deeper into my Buddhist practice, I've just been in a Buddhist rabbit hole for the last 5 years. So
is it Tibetan Buddhism, Kazi?
Yeah, so I practice under the Dzogchen lineage of Chogyam Namkhai Norbu. He's a late guru, but he's the teacher of my teacher, Malcolm Smith. And so that's sort of where my practice is based on. Some Vajrayana, but all basically in the context of Dzogchen.
Good, yeah. I'm a Zen guy, and I was the English teacher for a Zen priest from Japan many years ago, and we became close friends, and he became a Zen master. But we were very, very close for many years. He's passed away now, but
I will say real quickly, while I haven't really dug a lot into Eastern and sort of Upper Eastern Buddhism, Chan and Zen, only because I'm trying to understand my own tradition. I will say from everything I've been studying and sort of experiencing, it does seem like Dzogchen at least has more relevance and sort of similarities to Zen than arguably the Indo-Tibetan tradition that it's sort of in, which is very interesting. Every other path is very gradual based in a sort of step-by-step sort of idea with a lot of analysis. Not that Dzogchen doesn't have this, but there's sort of more direct, non-conceptual, immediate emphasis. I think Zen and Dzogchen seem to share a lot in common.
I sense that from the Zen side as well. I always hear an affinity there. But Jared, tell us, what would you like to bring to this conversation? You shared with me, you can share with Kazi as well.
Yeah, so I have some ideas of how we could kind of unpack this essay together and explore some other related sorts of more broader themes of some of your work here. So maybe to start, would you just want to tell us a little bit about this essay that you've written? Buddhism is basically useless. Where did the ideas come from? How did you find the inspiration for this? Was there something you were trying to respond to in particular with this work?
Yeah, so I can actually start with the title, actually. So before I met my current teacher, I was sort of practicing along with the Shambhala tradition of Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. And they've been having a pretty big controversy lately. I don't know if you guys heard, but that's besides the point. But when I first started studying with them, they had this concept of what they called basic goodness. And later on, I basically, understood that to be, their word for Buddha nature, basically. It basically functioned the same way. They weren't really explicit at first about this. And I also joined them when I was very early on into my path. So I was still absorbing a lot of things too. But at that time, I also sort of started experiencing in my own practice a sense of complexity in what I was experiencing that had a basic goodness in it, but there's also senses of longing, right? And a sense of wanting to long, which now I see as a kind of like I guess is a sense of goodness, because now I recognize it as something akin to bodhicitta, the sense of longing to be with others in a sense. But I guess like just the idea of characterizing it as good rather than bad, so whenever I see one term emphasized, my mind just instinctively goes, well, what's wrong with the opposite side? And why does this have this one-sided characterization? And I would always keep thinking about this as well. And then in my own experience, understanding Buddha nature as being basically good, but also having the potential to also move into ignorance. There's this dual potential, like where the nature of our mind has this capacity to go in these two different directions, in either ignorance or awakening. And part of what is, I think, realized with the full expression of our Buddha nature, especially in sort of the experience of emptiness, right, is this sense that there is nothing there to grasp onto as a basis for the ground, path, and fruit of our whole practice, because everything is fundamentally empty. And so for me, Buddhism is basically useless is also equivalent to saying Buddhism is basically good. They're both referring to the same meaning, but I like the poetic use of isolating one just for for an aesthetic purpose, I guess. And that's a lot of what I was trying to do with this essay, not just a theory piece, but also kind of like a creative piece where I'm trying to use language which appears to be very negative, but which is trying to point to something that's actually seemingly the opposite. Basically useless is like my version of basically good. And part of what that means is that like Buddha nature is not a thing that you can use. Right, and that's why it's useless in the sense that it's not a thing we can objectify, and so it's not something we can reach towards, right, or even something that we can reach away from, because that's assuming it's a thing that's distinct from us in some sense. So that's why I say Buddhism, in the sense, sort of referring to Buddha nature, is basically useless.
Interesting. Yeah, it definitely came through, I'd say, in your words that this isn't necessarily a bad thing. This is probably a grace or something that opens us up to what Buddhism is really about. And I mean, all this language is problematic. So flipping it as a sort of poetic device away from always emphasizing the good, the substantial, these sorts of classic habits of mind that certainly we have as Westerners, but many Buddhists do as well. Yeah, very, very interesting to see this approach.
Actually, what you just said, I just want to quickly say, what you just said also made me think of or remember another motivation I do have, which is that I do see that I think that the way that Eastern spirituality in general has been sort of transmitted to the West is, and from what I see, has a very characteristically positivistic bent to it, or positive bent to it. But there's a diminishment, I think, or I've seen in sort of the more, what we can say, the negative aspects in terms of analysis and deconstruction and all of these things. And so I guess part of what I want to do in this essay and some of my other work is to, I guess, use a strategy of tactical nihilism as a way to sort of counteract the perhaps eternalistic use of Buddhism, reception of Buddhism in the West, which is understandable if, ex-Christians might still have some, prevailing, a latent assumption that they still haven't gotten rid of in their atheistic phase, which they bring along in their interpretation of Buddhism. And that takes this sort of pseudo-theistic bent, right? So a lot of my other work, and as well as essay, is trying to go against a bit of this current by deploying this more tactically nihilistic language.
Right. Yeah. Seems like a worthwhile project in light of the interesting ways Buddhism has been received in America, but other parts of the Western world as well. Putting it in a more neutral way there. Yeah, I was wondering, is this essay also implicitly going against this notion that, oh, Buddhism or Eastern spirituality in general is so useful? Oh, we can improve our wellness and be more productive workers. This kind of mindfulness phenomenon that people have started to really notice in recent times. Is that part of the project here as well, would you say?
Yes, definitely. I've mentioned earlier in my introduction of how Marx and the Marxist tradition definitely informs a great deal of how I understand things. And so there's definitely this sort of sort of critical critique of mindfulness that is definitely in the background, in the sense that part of the way that Buddhism and Buddhist techniques have been appropriated by the West is through this productivist mentality that we can make use of these different things to acquire meritorious results, merits, and values in economic and productive life, and which for me it sort of starts to just be a way in which Buddhism is used to re-entrench and restabilize, samsaric existence rather than going beyond it. And so, definitely, part of the interest also behind the idea that Buddhism is useless is to sort of also undercut this idea that Buddhism can be deployed for any kind of mundane result. Which isn't to say it doesn't offer that, but a lot of the sort of yogic techniques and sort of meditative techniques that you find in Buddhism, you can also find in other traditions. What really distinguishes, I think, Buddhism or the Buddha Dharma from other forms of thinking and being is the particular kind of perspective it takes on. We call this the view in Dzogchen, not particularly an intellectual view, but a kind of mode of awareness or disposition that conditions how we actually use the techniques that are given to us. The techniques are not, value neutral in that sense either.
One of the other things I was kind of wondering in response to this piece is who exactly are the Buddhists that you are taking aim at? Certainly, I can imagine these types of Western Buddhists, these kinds of Stephen Batchelor style post-metaphysical Buddhism 2.0. This sort of perspective seems really ripe for that critique. But I'm wondering also, is a traditional Buddhist someone you have in mind here, or is it a more specific kind of Western Buddhist that you're taking aim at?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks. I definitely say both. So one of the interesting things I think with the sort of secular Buddhist sort of movement is that I actually think there's a sentiment to it that I think is noble, which is this idea of like really trying to get to the core of the Buddhist teachings and the core of the Buddhist meanings and trying to extrapolate what is essential to the Dharma that's not just, a contingent product of historical conditions, mediated by power structures, economic systems that might even get in the way of real Dharma transmission and such. So I understand that. But I think that this sort of cherry picking form of elimination that they choose just ends up sort of distorting it even more. And I think, so for me, to say Buddhism is basically useless, it's sort of like taking the secular Buddhist intent and saying, okay, well, you think rebirth in karma is useless, but everything else in Buddhism is useful. Well, actually, everything is in Buddhism is useless. The process of negation has not gone far enough in this sense. And on the flip side, with the traditionalist, I find that I do have a few sort of traditionalist-oriented friends. Sometimes I think they have a kind of extreme reaction to the way that Buddhism is characterized in the West, particularly in secular Buddhism. But I feel like a lot of times I think this just more so reflects not so of a concern of what the proper way of doing Buddhism is, as so much as it is a concern over sort of losing this fundamental eternal core of the Dharma that's fundamentally based in karma and rebirth and all that and all these things. And I think in both senses you have this fetishization of Buddhism and the Buddhist teachings as something I guess like both senses, they're sort of attached to Buddhism as a way of identifying in a certain way that allows them to ground themselves with a certain kind of stability in a world of constant flux. In many ways, I think the biggest danger to Buddhism is Buddhism itself. Once you've created an identity around not having an identity, you're stuck forever in a way. It sort of parallels a lot what some people say in Madhyamaka literature, particularly Nagarjuna too, when there's no saving the one who is a completely misunderstood emptiness. In a way, actually trying not to understand emptiness is better than misunderstanding it. So for me, it's like Buddhism. It's all or nothing, really.
Yeah. I think here of all sorts of different spiritual folks who believe they have transcended the ego. These are the people who, in terms of the ego, are stuck the hardest, because they've conceptualized being beyond in a way that, it reifies some concepts and some experiences, and situates self in a way that Buddhism is in its traditional formulations really trying to cut right against. And so, it was pretty clear to me that your critique here could be leveled against both the traditionalist Buddhists and the more Western style folks. And it really made me think in Christianity of this idea of the Protestant principle, that within Protestant Christianity, there's always this aspect of critique against tradition, against new movements, that is always coming back to the life of Christ through the Gospels. And this is sort of this superordinate source or principle that Christians can go to as sort of a ground for critique of all sorts. And so I felt something very similar was going on in your essay here. So I'm curious what's the principle, what's the ground from which you are making this critique that's cutting both against tradition and more contemporary forms of Buddhist understanding.
Yeah, I think one of the things I was trying to also understand myself through this work, and that's another thing I should sort of state from this. One of the reasons behind starting this blog is also to not just write finished products, but in a way, these finished products are parts of the process of me thinking. And so this is very much also me thinking through things through this essay, then sort of giving my conclusion. And I try not to really fix down into any ultimate conclusion, but continuously inquire and question various assumptions that we might have about Buddhism and such. And so I like that you brought up tradition, because it's a really great way that we can divide these two different orientations, and what we can say is that the bifurcation in the way that Buddhism is being approached today, which is a kind of Western-oriented secular approach, which also has its roots in the modernist Buddhist movement in Asia, but we can put that aside for now. And the more traditionalist, Asian view, and especially a lot of my friends who do take the tradition aside do tend to be from Buddhist families or from Asia, so it's very understandable. So the Westerners, they take this characteristic, Western approach, which is asserting your individuality against tradition, and sort of the autonomy of the individual is a really important principle, I think, to Western liberal society. Whereas in the East, the sentiment is very much seeing yourself as part of an undivided continuum, a kind of greater social body that weaves through generations. But what I really like about Buddhism, when I think genuinely experienced and understood, as well as Whitehead, is this understanding that the individual and the collective are, inseparable from one another, and that both are actually the conditions for each other's flourishing. And so any abstraction of one from the other is doomed in some way or another to either incoherence or suffering, or usually both.
Jay, I've been stealing your podcast here. Do you want to hop in with something?
When I read your essay, I began to picture three kinds of people. And type 1 was a person, not a Buddhist, who heard the doctrine of anatman, no self, said, well, interesting idea, but I don't think it's for me. I'm going to get on with my life. And the second person was a self-identified Buddhist who really liked the idea of an anatman, and for that matter, kind of keen on being a Buddhist too, thought that was a pretty great thing, and was attached to your wonderful phrase, the magisterium of Buddhist teachings and the identity of being a Buddhist. They were kind of objects of clinging. So that was type 2. And then type 3 was surprising to me, but I really liked it. It was a person who, in your language, actually touched, you use the word touch so often, touched a deeper side of their lives and had a kind of sense of awakening to that totality, and did so without the defensiveness of the first or the spiritual pride of the second. But then it seems to me, Kazi, you were kind of even more sympathetic to type 1 than type 2. And so as I read your essay, I think you really like these people that touch. and then you're kind of sympathetic to those people that would resist the idea, but you said it kind of wasn't their fault. And then you were kind of, a little tougher on those self-identified Buddhists full of spiritual pride. But I liked the whole thing. And so one question I want to raise, I got a couple of questions. One is, tell me more about what you mean by touching. And that's question one. And then I do have another question, a follow-up to that. But go ahead with that, if you don't mind.
Sure. Yeah. So specifically, I refer to touching yourself, and and if it's not obvious, it definitely should bring up ideas of masturbation. I'll say that right off the bat, and which is actually something that a few people picked up on specifically, and put out such unfounded judgments about the essay just because they isolated that particular meaning. But which I'm happy they got that meaning, but it's not the full meaning, of course. Otherwise, the essay won't make any sense. And so I'm playing with this sort of triple meaning of touching yourself, in the sense of there's like a crude level, coarse level, and then there's like a middle level, and then it's in the subtlest level. The coarsest level is just masturbation, touching yourself physically, literally. The middle is just sort of general, but still significant self-knowledge, really deep understanding of who you are and your nature and your tendencies, your conditions, your traumas, a deeper sense of understanding who you are, which I think tends to, but not always, happen sort of post-adolescence, when you're sort of out of, once you're moving into adulthood and then really thinking about like, oh, what is my place in this world? And you start to think more about who you are as a person and become more sensitive to that. And then at the final, most subtle level is, self-reflexive gnosis, the awakened mind itself, which knows itself to be what it is. And for me, there is a sort of continuum that we can draw from masturbation to self-knowledge to self-reflexive gnosis. And the reason why I say this is that in a sort of strict sense, they all in some way relate to the sense of nakedness, the sense of being without a medium, getting in the way of yourself, right? It's just sort of direct contact. And for a long time, I've had my a sort of shameful relationship to masturbation, but it wasn't over time until I really started to sort of come to a sense of who I was in myself, the understanding that being intimate with myself was not something to be eschewed or denigrated. And then it made me think of like, why did I even have that sense of shame in the first place? And for some reason or another, we're always doing this thing where we're trying to come to ourselves, but we'll do it through some kind of medium. So we'll never actually get back to ourselves in that direct sense. And this might sound kind of weird, but so Immanuel Kant, there's some, I think there are letters. I'm not sure if he actually wrote them in an actual like book or a treatise, but he has some very negative views on masturbation in the sense that, if I remember correctly, you masturbate when you surrender your rational faculty that defines you as a human, and so you sort of regress into the animal level. But then for his philosophy, right, reality can only ever be mediated through the categories of human understanding. And so the reality, which is Kant, right? Kant is a part of reality. Reality is him in some simplistic way, if we say it like that. Yet he cannot reach the reality of his own self without this medium, which fundamentally delimits from the very outset, what his whole activity could be. It's not even that his activity is wayward, but the categories that condition his experience is from the very beginning. The a priori categories fundamentally condition how experience can happen. And I think there's also this interesting connection between the external noumena and the subjective noumena as both being noumena. And I think this sort of points to this sense of how there's this understanding that there is a place where self and other contact in an indivisible reality, in a kind of noumenal reality, but it can never be accessed without the mediation of the human understanding that gives rise to the phenomenal world. And for the Buddhist, this structure, this a priori structure of experience, is precisely what is to be negated in the realization of emptiness, resulting in a direct contact, a direct naked experience with your own condition. And so I still haven't really made in my own head this connection between the sort of this thinking and this and what we do day to day with master in our daily lives, But I think it just goes to show that how we think reflects how we are, and how we are reflects how we think. And so this is here the connection. And so I see that in a way, people who might have aversion to truly being in touch with the reality of themselves also would be weirdly averse to physically pleasuring themselves. So self-knowledge is definitely a kind of nice medium between physical self-contact and spiritual self-contact. It's part of the necessary process of moving from the coarse to the subtle levels of self-touching, touching yourself. I guess another thing I should mention is that particularly my tradition, based on the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, it's in many ways, I wouldn't necessarily say it's sex positive, but it definitely sees the potentials within, sexual encounter, sexual union as a basis for realization. So my reference to sexuality is not, I think foreign entirely to this Buddhist sentiment, though I haven't really seen much about masturbation. So sexual tantra obviously typically involves a practitioner and the consort, who's also the practitioner, so a union of two. But at the same time, especially in the figure of the Yabiyum, the sort of divine couple, Samantha Bhadra and Samantha Bhadri, in sort of a sexual union, in a way, from the perspective of the Dharmadhatu, the sphere of ultimate reality, they're both empty, so they're sort of the same thing, So it's kind of sex, which is also autosexual self-relation in that sense, something akin to masturbation.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And actually, when I read the word touching, I didn't think of masturbation, but I did think of the third meaning, the kind of deep self-knowledge. But I see the continuum that you're talking about. And I want to put that in Whiteheadian terms, just for the fun of it. And so in process and reality, we are moments of experience, moment by moment. That's who we are and what we are. In every moment of experience is a process of the many becoming one, and then being increased by one. And that process isn't just something mechanical that you look at from the outside, from a third person perspective. Subjectively, it's a process of feeling. We feel the presence of our bodies and the surrounding world and the heavens and the hills and rivers. They are the many that become one in every moment. And part of that process in ordinary waking consciousness involves a whole lot of conceptuality, conceptual prehensions, which can help us integrate the gathering into unity, but also filter it, almost in those Kantian terms. But every moment of experience actually begins, thinks Whitehead, with what he calls experience in the mode of causal efficacy. That's the phrase he uses. It's the experience of being moved by something. And his primary example in process and reality is bodily experience. And 2 or 3 times in process and reality, he uses the phrase, the withness of the body, W-I-T-H, withness of the body. So our experience always begins with, you could argue, it always begins with our body. And he also has a little phrase in Process Reality where he says, but where does the body end? Is the skin its contours? And in dialogue, well, I think it's with Descartes, he says something like, actually, the whole world is my body. The whole world is mine. That's the way he puts it. So that's how I would link that kind of deep self-knowledge of what you're speaking with intimacy with the body and a falling away of conceptualities that ordinarily filter that. And if you imagine a state of consciousness in which that really happens, it's not just an idea I'm sharing, you actually experience that.
Right.
There would be a dropping away of a sense of an isolated individual and a dropping away of concepts and a kind of strange kind of awareness of, how to put it, holopoiesis. So that's how I would read what you're saying. And if that misrepresents it, forgive me. But if it illuminates a little bit of it, great. But then I want to ask another question, if I could. I'm reading your essay and I'm getting that, what do you call it? The negativity, the technical nihilism. What's the phrase you use?
Tactical nihilism.
Tactical nihilism. I'm getting that spirit, no to this, no to that, no to this, no to that, no to this. And then all of a sudden I come upon this paragraph and I think, where does this come from? I'll read it to you. May the infinite loving compassion and boundless luminous vision of the uncountable multiplicity of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas who pervade every duration of time and every extent of space in the entire manifold cosmos secretly conspire to lure, there's that Whitehead word, the Buddhist, to the unobstructed awakening of the indestructible heart of his selfless self. And I thought, this is almost devotional. This is devotional. And it's really kind of beautiful. It is beautiful. And it was such a nice contrast, actually, with what came before. I thought, ooh. But I do want to tell you what I wonder. And this has a little something to do with maybe the Zen in me. You know what koans are in the Rinzai tradition. And here's one famous koan. A student of the way asked Yunmen, what is Buddha? Yunmen replied, dried shit stick. That's it. So the monk comes up to the Yunmen and says, what is the Buddha? And he says, a dried shit stick. And there's another koan that kind of goes like that. What is the Buddha? It's 3 pounds of flax. And what's going on in those koans? It's a prodding to get the monk to get out of his or her head, most were he's, out of his head into the immediacy of the present moment. So throw away all the holy slogans, throw away all the advanced rhetoric, throw away all the ideals, throw away the very idea of the holy, get over purity. So here's my question. Do you think that sometimes language such as the indwelling, indestructible heart of perfect awakening, that is the essence of mind itself, can itself become an object of grasping and thus undercut the very heart of the Buddha way? Because I kind of saw your bottom line, forgive me if I'm wrong, but I kind of saw your bottom line as deep within us, there's this luminous wisdom and amorous splendor. And that's almost eternal. And the Zen in me wanted to say, no, you know what's inside us? A dried shit stick. In other words, don't cling. Okay. Any response, any thoughts on your part?
Yeah, thank you for all those comments and observations. I will say I really like what you did mention about the emphasis on causal efficacy or perception in the mode of causal efficacy in Whitehead, and this sort of preconceptual, almost even precognitive state of just pure immersion in the sheer force of the past and all the actualities in it. And there's this kind of the fullness in there where the self almost hasn't had a chance to fully crystallize. Right. And so it's sort of indivisible with everything outside of itself. And so it's almost like this contact with the other, but if the other's not there, it's also a self-contact. So
Yeah, right.
I definitely really like that, especially because for me, there's definitely a sense in which this self-reflexive gnosis is also sort of primordially present in a sense that it's always not just what we lost with conceptuality, but kind of always beside conceptuality. It's as kind of like conceptuality is almost a distortion of it, right? So it's sort of almost there, but it's also there immediately prior to our conceptualizing and our evaluating. And so it's always there. And so I really like that connection. And thank you for bringing that up. And especially as from a Marxian angle, I like it whenever there's an emphasis on the soma, the body in process philosophy, because I guess this is something I can't throw off, I guess, because of my involvement in Marxist thought, but we tend to have this sort of suspicion of anything that might tend towards idealism, right? For any particular way. So I love it whenever Whitehead still grounded in the somatic experience and bodily experience, which I think is really key, and it's precisely what is lost in idealism, right? The importance of the body. Yeah. So you mentioned the sort of positive language I start using towards the end of this, and how there is definitely the risk of getting attached to this kind of these ideas and views as well.
May I jump in just really quickly there? I really think you can be attached to the negative as well as the positive. I mean, a person can. And so I really love language, and I love both kinds. And I'm aware of the fact that precisely because such language can be so lovable, both the technical nihilism and the devotional extravagance, they're fine. It's the attachment thereunto that I think becomes the problem.
Yeah, typically what I sort of do is, or in order to maintain this sort of middle way equipoise, I guess you could say, in my writing, is so some of my essays has a more of a kind of emotional, devotional character to it, a more sort of emphasis, I guess, what you could say, on the dependently originated luminosity of experience. It sort of really goes towards that. So my other writing more so emphasizes the emptiness aspect, the sort of the nihility of our conceptions of things as being eternal. And the way I try to make sure I don't veer off too much in either direction is to have a little bit of the other present. So if you go to my website and click on the About section where I go over the holopoiesis, there is a section in which I point to the inability to abstract a holon as really existing in any way. That actually when you look at a holon, when you really look at it, there's actually nothing there because it's indivisible from the continuum it's embedded in. And so in Buddhism, it's basically useless. I go through all this negativity and then add a little positive aspect in it, and as a way to balance, but not just to balance, but more so to sort of throw something like a koan to the reader, so they can be like, okay, wait, but you just destroyed everything, and then all of a sudden now you're basically telling me you're a Buddhist, but you said Buddhism is useless. And I think you could either think that I'm just a contradictory crazy person and dismiss me, that's fine, or you can try to understand what I'm doing and see that there might not actually be a huge difference between the two, and that this apparent difference is what I exploit for aesthetic purposes and a way to sort of almost force the reader to keep thinking along with me. Because I think, I have a tendency to think that our minds, possibly because of our Buddha nature, our minds are innately sort of tends towards resolution to some extent. And actually this desire for resolution, I think, is also sort of what brings us in suffering too, because this desire for resolution can also manifest in the desire to, have things go your way. But even the sort of path of dealing with and understanding and overcoming suffering is this sort of path of resolving as well. And so I find that if I add paradoxical, seemingly contradictory elements to my work, hopefully I sort of catalyze this process in the reader's mind, which is already innately predisposed to resolution, to hopefully work with me to resolve this apparent contradiction, so that I can basically point to the dependently originated nature of both positivity and negativity, that that both are just sort of different ways of approaching the same thing, which is incomprehensible and inexpressible in those linguistic terms. But also another reason why I wanted to include masturbation as like a touching yourself thing is because in some senses, from a certain kind of perspective, you can think of it as one of the most basest things you can do. Kant it literally thinks it's probably one of the most basest animalistic things a human can do. But I love that because it shows that it's perhaps one of the most pervasive ways in which this seed of self-reflexive gnosis is experienced by everyone who, and I feel like pretty much most people masturbate, I think. If they probably try to hide it too, or at some point in their life, but that's probably just my biased perspective. But all just to say that that I also want to also not just point to the sublime and exalted nature of the mind as this unity of luminous wisdom and amorous splendor, but also it's so basic as just masturbating. It's and so maybe that's my version of the dried shit stick. It's just like awakening is kind of like masturbation to some extent. It's just this direct touching with yourself, and in a way, and I also like the idea that masturbating is apparently selfish and not, it's not involved with someone else. It's a sort of self-relation. But at the same time, ironically, I find that people who are okay with themselves so that they can okay with touching with themselves and being comfortable with that, or even the fact that people do it, I think they're predisposed to also just be more compassionate and understanding of other people's bodily desires and stuff too. I don't think it's a coincidence that people who might have a negative view of masturbation will have a pretty, negative or mean acidic disposition to those who do it, or the idea of doing it. And sort of Kant's whole text on that is a great example of that.
So, about irresolution, an interesting dimension of Whitehead's philosophy is that here's the phrase he uses: completion is the perishing of immediacy. And what that means is in every moment of experience, there's an aim at completion. There's a subjective aim to gather the many into one in a single experiential gestalt. And it aims at satisfaction. That's exactly the word he uses. In a processing reality, satisfaction equals intensity. That's the term he uses. So every moment is an aim at intensity. And intensity is satisfying. That's all Whitehead. But interestingly enough, as soon as there's satisfaction, the immediacy perishes and something comes after that. So there's no finality. There's no finality. On the one hand, it cuts against that eros toward finality. This is it. I've arrived. But he had a need for finality too. And so that's where you find his discussion of peace in Adventures of Ideas, that there is a kind of harmony, he thought, that can be directly experienced. And that's his word, harmony. He actually speaks of it as harmony of harmonies. And it transcends personality. And it's actually, he calls it the consummation of the human soul. That's in his book, in Adventures of Ideas, the last chapter. So anyway, I hear all that when I hear luminous wisdom and amorous splendor. I hope you don't give up on, I know it's empty and all that, but I think there's some wisdom in the language too.
Well, fundamentally, I think it's interesting. There's the two truths, right? There's emptiness and dependent origination, but there's also the way in which one side of the two truths also collapses both of them, right? So from the side of emptiness, there's not even any two truths. So what you think is nihilistic, actually, when taken to its logical end, is absolutely inseparable from the dependently originated matrix of all experience. It's this undivided continuum. But the mind can't help but decide on one side of this infinitely spinning coin. It needs a stasis. And so for me, I think if we're going to talk at all, we can talk in these koanic ways, these paradoxical, contradictory ways, aesthetic ways. One of the things I really love about Whitehead is this emphasis on aesthesis as like the basis from which we do our philosophy. And the thing that our philosophy is about. Our philosophy is not about final ultimate truth, right? It's about the evocation of intensities. I think the Whitehead used somewhere, which I really love. I have a bit of a question for you, actually. It seems like you couldn't really consider Whitehead a teleological thinker, but there's something like a telos going on. So could you speak to that in any way?
Well, I think he is a teleological thinker in several ways, but not a telos that's arrived at after which there's no more process. There's not that kind of telos.
Right.
But there's telos at several other levels. In human life, every moment is a teleological act. You're trying to understand right now. I am too. You're seeking satisfaction in this conversation. I am too. Let's be honest. We have subjective aims. That's his phrase. That's part of life, part of experience. So that's teleological. I think in his understanding of God, that's in part 5 of Process and Reality. There's an important sense in which God is a cosmic lure toward intense becoming. And that cosmic lure is present everywhere throughout the universe. And it's also in us. And so as we open ourselves to the wideness, we experience within ourselves an indwelling lure toward fullness. And so the telos of the universe is also inside each one of us. But it's more than any of us or even all of us added together. And he uses the word God to name. God means a lot of things in Whitehead. God is also a companion, like a bodhisattva, a cosmic bodhisattva, Guan Yin, who shares in the sufferings of each and all in deep compassion. That's what he calls the consequent nature of God. And the primordial nature of God is we experience as that lure toward becoming. So they're both there. He knew, of course, that the word God can mean different things to different people. And so in Process and Reality, he was very critical of notions of God as kind of a totalitarian ruler. His quip is, the church wrongly rendered unto God that which belonged to Caesar. It wrongly did that. It rendered unto God that which belonged to Caesar. So he's deeply critical of politicized understandings of the divine, particularly if they lean toward totalitarianism or complete control or that kind of thing. But he was himself quite drawn. He grew up in a Christian background. He was quite drawn to Jesus, not as the Son of God like that, but he thought Jesus was about love. And so he speaks of the witness of Jesus as bespeaking the tender elements in the world that in quietness and operate by love. And he said that side of God is a little oblivious as to morals. That's a direct quote. So this side of God is not a moralist. This side of God is on the side of life. And life involves play, and all kinds of things besides being good. He thinks the universe itself is always beckoned by beauty. We experience God as a lure toward beauty. So beauty and intensity kind of go together for him. And they go together with the notion of contrast, which you used earlier. And that's actually one of his 8 categories of existence in Process and Reality is what kinds of things exist. And prehensions do, actual entities do, subjective forms do, eternal objects do. That's another issue. But contrasts, and they were fundamental to life. Contrast did not necessarily mean conflict. It could also mean complementarity, but you need the both and.
I will say, as in art school studying Whitehead, I did really hone in on this concept of contrast, and it really did actually help my own practice, because before I was sort of looking at different parts of a conceptual opposition sort of independently, but then once I understood that actually putting them together and working them together in these interesting contradictory paradoxical ways, contrasting ways is new ways of approaching everything. And I love that about him.
Well, rightly so. I mean, you honed down on something very important to him, and I'm glad that it helped you too. So both in Process and Reality in that book and in Adventures of Ideas in that book, that's where you will find Whitehead developing a bit of an aesthetic,
I see.
a philosophy of aesthetics. And it's going to work on contrast. The basic point is, in seeking beauty, we can smother the details in the interest of some broad stroke. And that becomes a problem. But we can also be so overwhelmed with details that we forget the broad strokes. That can also be a problem. So it's how to balance a sense of particularity and difference with a recognition of the coalescence of the many. And the contrasts actually enhance the differences. So it's like in the yin-yang diagram in China, the black really enhances the white, and the white enhances the darkness. They fold into one another. So that notion that differences are enhanced by contrast, very important to him, not eliminated.
Yeah, and I think from the Buddhist point of view, I guess something is eliminated, but what's eliminated is the idea that they're strictly opposed.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting.
Which for the Buddhists, has to be accounted for, because we do have this innate predisposition to want to grasp onto these ideas. And what I've been finding also from a Buddhist point of view, in many ways, I find Western thinkers might move towards dialectical modes of thinking as a way to go beyond sort of dichotomies, but which is, interesting, and a lot of productive thought has come out of this sort of the dialectical train of thinking. But even from a very strict Buddhist point of view too, it's even for there to be a dialectic between pairs, you would have to have bifurcated the pairs in the first place. So a dialectic is just sort of this ad hoc synthesis of a bifurcation that was never resolved in the beginning.
We lack language here, because a little earlier, you and I myself, you used the phrase immersion in the whole, or something to that effect, immersion in the totality of the past in the process of immediate experience. And I would have used exactly that word too, but that can suggest that there's a something separate from the whole that can be immersed into it.
Right.
And it's very hard to find language that avoids that kind of assumption. And
I kind of think that, in a way, language, we can never avoid that in language. And so that's why we have to use language in these indirect ways, these poetic ways, analogical ways, apophatic ways. And that way we sort of don't fool ourselves in the sort of impossible mission of expressing the inexpressible. And just play with the fact that if the expression is self-reflexively aware of the inexpressibility of what it's expressing, then I think it's innocent. If it can give that off well enough, it's not trying to convince you that it actually has what it's saying, because a metaphor doesn't pretend to be anything other than a metaphor, unless the metaphor user uses it differently, but that would be improper use.
What we should do, Kazi, I don't know if we'll ever talk again, but I've really enjoyed this.
Hopefully.
I need to go myself, but I would love to have this very same discussion using visual art. In other words, everything that we've just said about language and metaphor and the like, and the limits of language and the need for paradox, I would like to hear that same discussion with images. Because I think I lean toward the verbal. I'm thinking about language there, I'm thinking about words. And I'd also like it with sound, by the way. Let's go music.
Music is an amazing medium to understand all these topics as well, in terms of indirectly expressing the inexpressible.
I wanted to ask you something right there, back to touching just for a second. I began to wonder, when people do touch their bodies or the mystery or the depths or, whatever we want to say, the luminous wisdom and amorous splendor. I wonder if sometimes music isn't an occasion for that, if that absorption into music as well as the body isn't an opening into the wideness. So varieties of touching, that's your next essay.
No, that's a very nice suggestion. I definitely like that. Actually, over the pandemic, for the first time, I actually picked up an instrument.
Did you?
Yeah, I started with an acoustic guitar. I played it for 2 weeks and I was like, this is absolutely amazing. I'm gonna get myself an electric guitar ASAP. So I did. And then I discovered surf rock and I fell in love with it. And I've been trying to play it. But in the process, I had this new appreciation for not just music, but sound as a physical phenomenon in general. And before I was, unfortunately, naively listening to music almost as like a kind of information processing machine, right? It's like goes in, I hear it, I like it or I don't like it, and then off. But actually playing a physical instrument and feeling the vibrations reverberating, but not just that, but being able to actually feel like I was literally like almost taking the feelings out of my body into the music. It's hard to describe. I'm sure as a musician, you of course understand, but it definitely is a different form of putting yourself out there.
And it has, I just understand completely. It has something to do with vibrations and a lot to do with touch. The very touch of the fingers on the strings and the fact that sound comes from that and different sounds is just kind of gorgeous.
Yeah. And another thing, once I had this interesting experience is, after a good session of my sadhana, my meditation practice, I go over to my guitar to sort of play some tunes and learn a surf rock song. And then I started studying surf rock a little bit and the history behind it while listening. And then I started feeling this weird, almost mystical experience of this connection to this time period in the 60s and the 70s and in the shores of California, as if like I was there, and this power of sound and music to transmit the past is amazing. And it's not even just a conceptual thing, but like the physical vibrations of the sound and the guitar is, if not exact, it's not going to be the exact same thing. Of course, every performance is different, but at least the logic and structure is the same. And it is sort of a way that harkens back to this moment in which those sounds were first conceived. Yeah. And it was just a beautiful experience. And I don't know why it took me so long to start playing my own music, but I'm glad I started.
Oh, I am too. I need to go, and I want to let you two visit a little bit, but it's great to be with both of you. So peace be with everybody. See you next time.
Conversations in Process is a podcast from Open Horizons and the Cobb Institute, hosted by Jay McDaniel. If you enjoy these conversations and would like to support the show, consider becoming a friend of the Cobb Institute or making a donation at cobb.institute. Or leave a review through Apple Podcasts to help others find out about the show. Thank you for listening.